Jordan against the Jazz, Mahomes against the Bills, Aikman against the Bills, Brady against the Jets, the Colts, and, well, the Bills. There's something beautiful about that one player who just crushes a certain opponent every single time they play them. Unless it's happening to your team, then it's not as fun. It's one of the most fascinating sports phenomena to me, the player who just raises their game against a certain team, whether it's revenge or pure luck, whether it's Hall of Famers or Jags. These guys become the biggest enemies in an entire city. They may never mean more than they do to that one place that hates them. Now, there are some villains who will come from a dirty play or ridiculous antics. It's the reason why Alex Burrows and Ulf Samuelsson won't be taking vacations to Boston anytime soon. But I want to focus on the guys who aren't just pests. I want to focus on the guys who were good, the guys the Bruins just couldn't stop, or the guys the Bruins couldn't stop stopping the Bruins. Let's give a definitive list for the top 5 Bruins killers in history. Number 5, and certainly the most recent one to appear on our list, that would be one Matthew Tkachuk. Now, clearly the newest one, most recent, definitely some recency bias there. And it does seem a little weird when you do the research and you see that he's only actually played 20 regular season games against the Bruins in his whole career. And he does have 19 points in those 20 games, so that's something. But he gets on this list because of what he's done against them in the playoffs. In 13 career playoff games against the Bruins, he has 16 points on 6 goals and 10 assists and was no doubt the engine behind that 2023 Florida Panthers team that pulls off one of the greatest upsets in NHL history. He had the overtime winner in Game 5, which kept him alive after they were down 3-1, and was no doubt like the biggest thorn in the side of the Bruins. And he really came in and instantly turned around a team that this fan base absolutely hates at this point, completely loathes the Florida Panthers, who were irrelevant to everyone before Matthew Tkachuk joined the team. Certainly a pest, as well as a heck of a player. Not only did he have the overtime game winner in that Game 5 in 2023, he also famously or infamously fought David Pastrnak in the 2024 series that just got totally wild. Would love to have him on my team any day of the week. But is he a guy that takes runs at European players who don't fight and takes runs at goalies? Yes, he does. Yes, he does. And to top it all off, to make it all the more worse, of course, we know his dad, a Boston native, Big Walt, Keith Tkachuk, one of the all-time New England hockey legends, right? Should be a Hall of Famer and will be a Hall of Famer. From this area, played at BU, just like Matthew's brother did, Brady Tkachuk. Matthew does not endear himself to Boston nearly as much as the rest of his family. So it definitely does make it hurt just a little bit extra. Moving on to number 4. Now, if you asked Bruins fans of my generation and you gave them this prompt, who are the greatest Bruins killers, I'll bet the first name they thought of was Thomas Vanek. Okay? Vanek is really the only one on this list who gets here on regular season play alone. And he more than made up for not playing the Bruins in the playoffs by what he did against them in the regular season. Now, Thomas Vanek had a good career for all intents and purposes. He had a very good career, right? Definitely one that gets you on the billboard in your hometown. All right. He played over 1,000 games in the NHL. He scored 373 goals, made an all-star team. More of a journeyman than he was an all-star, obviously. Played for 8 NHL teams and never really contributed much to winning, except against the Bruins, okay? So he's one of those guys who, is he close to Hall of Famer? Not really, but in 67 career games against the Bruins, he has 34 goals, dished out 36 assists, 70 points in 67 games, and was a plus 21 against them. That included a game in 2013, I remember, at the Garden, where he scored a hat trick and scored 5 points, and the Sabres beat him 7-4. So they needed every bit of Thomas Vanek to beat the Bruins in that game. If he had played his whole career against the Bruins, he'd have been a Hall of Famer. He's more than a point a game against them. Against everyone else, he didn't do enough to even appear on the Hall of Fame ballot. Now that, my friends, is a guy who knows how to kill one team and one team only. I was begging for years. He was always available at the trade deadline. I was thinking, man, if the Bruins can just get him, maybe this will be his most prolific stop yet, because he loves scoring at the Garden, but it was probably just against the Bruins and really against Tim Thomas. Just own those guys, man, forever and ever. This one is maybe the most frustrating for my generation because, again, he was just a solid player against everybody else. Matthew Tkachuk looks like a Hall of Famer, right? Thomas Vanek did not look like that, and he killed the Bruins. And that's not the last time that we'll see a guy who was good, solid, not Hall of Fame worthy, that put up Hall of Fame worthy numbers against the Bruins. Not the last time we'll see that on this list. The next guy, though, is Hall of Fame against the Bruins and definitely Hall of Fame against everybody else. Number 3, the great, the one, the only, Guy Lafleur. It's about time we get a Hab on this list, okay? He's not going to be the only one. Spoiler alert. There's 2 left after this, and you will see at least one more Hab. Guy is obviously one of those guys, or Guys? Guy is obviously one of those Guys. Do you have to say it that way? Who killed just about every team, but victimized the Bruins in the most important games of the season quite often, okay? During his career, Guy Lafleur scored more points against the Bruins than all but 3 NHL teams. And Boston was the only one of those top 4 teams that he scored against that wasn't completely hot garbage for the entire decade of the 1970s. Okay, the other ones were like the Kings, the Penguins, and someone else who was just ass the whole time. Maybe Detroit, that was just bad the whole decade. The Bruins were not that. That's what makes him such a great Bruins killer. 85 points in 80 career games on 34 goals and 51 assists. Played an entire season's worth of games against them in his career in the regular season and was better than a point a game. Of course, one of the main reasons he ends up on this list isn't just that, the regular season, but the fact that he crushed Bruins' dreams pretty much every spring. Knocked them out of the playoffs 4 times, including an 8-2 record against them in the Stanley Cup final alone, which also includes an overtime winner in Game 2 of the 1978 Stanley Cup final. And when you're scoring an overtime winner against a team in the Stanley Cup final, that's endeared in their memory forever. Looking at you, Andrew Shaw. Now, his most famous goal came against them, of course, in Game 7 of the 79 conference final, not in the Stanley Cup final, when the Bruins had this late lead at the Forum. I want to say it was 3-2. They were in pole position to beat the Habs in a playoff series for the first time in 35 years to that point. But it was Guy Lafleur who caused the havoc. He jumps onto the ice. Don Cherry needs Donnie Marcotte out there. It's a bad change, which leads to the too many men on the ice penalty, the most infamous penalty in Bruins history. And of course, not only does he basically draw the call, but it was Lafleur who scored the game-tying goal on this perfect shot. Brad Park has always called it a 1 in a million shot. He was on the ice for it, just barely off the ice, just barely inside the post. Classic Guy Lafleur. Habs win it, no T. Bruins lose. Lafleur becomes a villain forever. One of the great Habs players of all time, in one of the great Habs eras of all time, and in the one where the Habs victimized the Bruins maybe the most. Guy Lafleur has to be on here. I mean, has to be firmly on that Mount Rushmore of all-time Bruins killers. So he slots in at number 3. Let's swing it on down to number 2, and this is where we start to change the player profile a little bit. We're getting into goalies. Number 2, Braden Holtby. Goalie time should be no surprise because goalies are typically the biggest team killers, right? Braden Holtby is the modern version of that for Bruins fans. In his career, Holtby was 18-5 against the Bruins in the regular season. And in those games, he posted an absurd .940 save percentage and a .198 goals against average over that span. That is over an entire decade where you're playing a team every year, multiple times a year, and you put together like a Vezina winning season against them in 23 games over 9 years. It's actually what it is. It's actually like 8 years. That's incredible. And where they really gets under the skin of Bruins fans was in 2012. That's where he burst onto the scene. In the playoffs, Bruins were the defending Stanley Cup champions. They were facing Washington in the first round. The Caps were hurting, man. They barely scraped by to get in the playoffs as the 7th seed. They had the worst goals against of any team in the postseason. They were 21st in the league in goals against. And they were down to their 3rd goalie, this unproven kid named Braden Holtby. And if you've watched any kind of sports movie, you know how this ends. Holtby absolutely stole the series. Once again, going for a .940 save percentage. Having a .940 save percentage against them for your career and in this one series, for that to pop up twice is insane. Gave up just 15 goals on 248 shots through 7 games. And the Caps won the series in 7, with each game being decided by a single goal. Like, it's just nuts. The term absurd is what fits here. Like, nothing before it showed us that this was going to happen. A year after Tim Thomas has probably the greatest postseason run a goalie has ever had, Braden Holtby went toe-to-toe with him and beat him. Like, that series alone makes you an all-time great Bruins killer. That was a hell of a Bruins team. They won the Stanley Cup the year before. They went to the Stanley Cup final the year after. And Braden Holtby is the one who takes it over and knocks him out in the first round. Now, Holtby had a fine career. I think he won a Vezina as well, won a Stanley Cup, but it fizzled out pretty quickly. And when you look at his career stats and the defenses he played behind, it's just good. It's just solid. It's not great. If he played against the Bruins his entire career, he'd be a Hall of Famer. And to make matters worse, Holtby had only one more playoff game against the Bruins, and it happened in 2020. And it was the only game that Washington won in the series. They just couldn't figure the guy out, which is bad considering that, again, he was just an above-average goalie, pretty solid the rest of his career. Braden Holtby comes in at number 2. Now, before we get to number 1, it's time for a couple of honorable mentions because I know there are some names that people are like, how has he not said this one yet? First of 3 honorable mentions, PK Subban. Now, Subban was obviously a great Bruins villain because of the brashness, the confidence, the cockiness, the way he played. But his career numbers against them really aren't that great. 19 points and a -5 rating in 45 career games against them. Now, he did, however, come up really big in some big moments in the playoffs, okay? He had a Game 6 game-winning goal that forced a Game 7. I believe that was in 2011. He had an overtime winner in 2014 in a series that the Canadiens knocked out the regular season champions, the President's Trophy winning Bruins. And then, of course, in Game 7 in 2011, it's kind of forgotten about now because the Bruins won. But he scored a late game-tying goal on the road. I think it was at 18:03 of the 3rd period. And remember, he kind of gave one of these, trying to hear the Bruins fans and force that game into overtime, force the Bruins to the ropes in a year that they won the Stanley Cup. But of course, Nathan Horton won it in OT, so you don't really remember that. But he's got some moments against the Bruins, that's for sure. But maybe not quite good enough head-to-head to make it on this list. Other honorable mention, Mr. Hockey, Gordie Howe. Not many lists that Gordie Howe is just an honorable mention on when it comes to great players. And when it comes to, if you want to get it down to the very definition of a Bruins killer, Gordie Howe is probably going to have to be your pick. No one has ever scored more points against the Bruins. 349 points in a ridiculous 317 career games against the Bruins. In fact, Gordie Howe has more points against the Bruins than any one player has had against any one single team in the history of hockey. But in the original 6 era, that certainly gets inflated. He did play them in the playoffs, but it was only twice. And if we're being honest, the Bruins were really bad for most of Gordie's really long career. Throughout the 60s, they were horrible. In the back half of the 50s, they had some good teams. They made the Stanley Cup final in a 6-team era twice in a row. But in the early 50s, they weren't very good either. So most of Gordie's prime years, he was playing some really bad Bruins teams. And he doesn't necessarily have the playoff numbers against him. So that's why he doesn't make the list. The next guy, the last honorable mention, does have some playoff moments against the Bruins, and that is Carey Price. This is a sneaky one because a lot of fans, again, of my generation remember the victories over Carey Price and, the Carey. And outside of that sweep that the Bruins had in 2009, he was nails against the Bruins. Okay, had a career .918 save percentage against them and a .255 goals against average for his career. Both those numbers went up in the playoffs. But when you have a series sweep against you on the books, it's tough for me to call you an all-time Bruins killer. And he's not quite the biggest Bruins killer amongst Canadiens goalies. I think you know where I'm going with this one. Number one, the all-time greatest Bruins killer, the late, great Ken Dryden. The real inspiration for this list, obviously, Dryden passed away about a week and a half ago. Certainly one of the great ambassadors ever for the game of hockey. Really tough not to like the guy unless you just have a real thing against nerds. Then maybe that's easy. But the real inspiration for this list, because I don't think there's anyone you could put above Ken Dryden for all that this context has. Now, stick with me. It's story time because the legend starts in 1971. Okay, there's context that's very much needed here. The Bruins in 1971 are not only the defending Stanley Cup champions, but they have broken every offensive record in the books. They set a new NHL standard for wins, points, goals scored, and goal difference in this season. Before 1971, only 4 NHL players had scored 100 points in this season, all time, ever. That had only happened 4 times. The Bruins had 4 100-point scorers that year on their own team. Phil Esposito, Ken Hodge, Bobby Orr, and Johnny Busick. They doubled the amount of 100-point scorers in the over 50-year history of the NHL that one year alone. Phil Esposito destroyed the single-season goal record. He scored 76 goals that year. Only Wayne Gretzky and Brett Hull have scored more in a season than Phil Esposito that year. Bobby Orr cashed in 102 assists as a defenseman. Only Wayne Gretzky has more assists in a season than Bobby Orr. These guys were unstoppable until they were stopped. Somehow, a 23-year-old former college hockey goalie, talk about looking your nose down on someone back then, a guy who played college hockey, with 6 career games before the playoffs, stopped the greatest and most talented team in NHL history to that point. And the Habs stole the 7-game series. Jean Beliveau's last year with the Canadiens, they thought they had no chance going into this playoff against such a strong Bruins team, but they had Ken Dryden. That's all they had. They had Ken Dryden, and they knew how to play against the Bruins, I guess. In his career, he knocked the Bruins out of the playoffs 4 times in 4 meetings with a .910 save percentage in those games, including beating them for the Stanley Cup twice. And like Guy Lafleur, was 8-2 against them in the Stanley Cup final. That is crazy, man. That's nuts. As much as Ken Dryden apparently loved Boston, talks about that in his books, talked about it in interviews, loved Boston. I think the only thing he loved more was beating the shit out of them at every time of asking. Every time it was against them, he came up big. And I think what's so interesting is when you look at those great Canadiens teams of the late 1970s, in that 77 season, I want to say, was the one where they lost 8 games in the regular season. I think it was like 11 for the entire season, like including the playoffs. And 3 of them came against the Bruins that year. I think it was actually 4 out of 11. So they were pretty evenly matched for the most part until it came to the games that mattered. So Ken Dryden made a living out of beating the Bruins in the playoffs 4 times in 4 meetings, but it goes even further than that. In 1967, he's playing for Cornell, and whom did they beat to win the national championship? Of course, the only college hockey team that simply wears Boston across their chest, the Boston University Terriers, captained by Jack Parker at that point. And to add insult to injury, Ken Dryden in the 1964 NHL draft was selected 14th overall by the Boston Bruins. He went to college, so he was traded for two guys that don't even have Wikipedia pages. At Montreal, got Ken Dryden. No notes, no question about it. The biggest Bruins killer in history is the late, great Ken Dryden. No other way you can go here. No other way. And to add some more insult to injury here, because we're just going through a lot of Bruins pain right now, Ken Dryden is the best goalie of the 1970s. He plays 8 years, wins 6 Stanley Cups and 5 Vezina trophies. And the year that he takes off to be a lawyer in Toronto, which obviously will never happen again, that's another year that the Bruins make the Stanley Cup final because they didn't have to face Montreal. But the second best goalie in that era, in that decade, is probably the guy who ended up actually beating the Bruins in the 74 Stanley Cup final. Again, just a cruel twist of irony. It's Bernie Parent who beats him 1-0, shuts out that great 74 Bruins team in Game 6 for the Flyers to win their first Stanley Cup. Just like Ken Dryden was selected by the Bruins, Bernie Parent started his career with the Boston Bruins. He and Reggie Leach were left unprotected. Both their goalies. Reggie Leach was gone in a deal before that. Bernie Parent left unprotected in the expansion draft, and the new expansion Philadelphia Flyers go and pick him up. So how about that? In an era where the Bruins made the Stanley Cup final 5 times in that decade, they made the Cup final. They won it twice. They were the best team in hockey basically throughout that decade outside of Montreal. They should have won more Stanley Cups, and they probably would have if they had just held on to either of the two goalies that they let go for nothing. That's what makes Ken Dryden the best Bruins killer of all time, and Bernie Parent deserves his shout out as well. But let me know what you think. There are certainly some other guys that you could put on this list. Ron Francis is the only one in the top 20 goal scorers against the Bruins that didn't play in the original 6 era. That's a pretty interesting one. There are certainly some guys that more playoff based in the last 10, 15 years. Sidney Crosby's regular season numbers against the Bruins are great, but has only played 4 playoff games against them and lost them all. So if you have any other suggestions for who the greatest Bruins killers of all time are, let me know in the comment section below. Then be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, come on back every weekday where we're here live at high noon Eastern time, talking a lot of Bruins and everything else going on in the world of Boston sports. And if you miss us, check out the other videos on the YouTube channel, Talking Boston Sports. I'm your host, Cam Stewart. Zach Burke keeps this on the air, giving you your lunchtime alternative to Boston Sports Talk Radio here on The Cam Show.